Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. I wanted to do a video today talking about 4 books that I personally have read, and what I found was when I'd finished reading all 4 of them, saw a really big connection between what they were all trying to say and how, after reading them, what it did to help me become a better leader, understand how my brain works and how I can be more productive and motivate myself by understanding the psychology and the neurobiology of how a brain operates, and use that to my advantage and use that to my team's advantage as well. So let's crack into it. So the 4 books that I want to talk to you about, the first one is called Grit, and I'm going to go through them in the order I would recommend you read them in. So it's Grit by Angela Duckworth. Now Grit talks about understanding the research that Angela did to try and understand what makes somebody be more motivated, more driven to excel and to achieve their goals. How do you determine that within somebody who has that internal motivation, that driver to make them push harder than anybody else? And one of the reasons she was doing this was part of the US program for training recruits. And if you think about the example of the Navy SEALs, I'm sure we've all seen G.I. Jane and other movies and stuff about the Navy SEAL program and how hard it is. And just a couple stats for you. So 90% of the people that complete the SEAL pre-indoctrination training, only 33% of those actually pass phase 1 of BUDS training. And BUDS training is the one where it's all hardcore on the beach and they're doing all this difficult work. But out of that 33%, 96% pass phase 3 of BUDS. And what the military obviously wanted to try and understand, that's what Angela was doing her research on, was how can we almost pre-turn who's going to get through to that level, so we don't have to waste time, culling out all the bad apples, so to speak, out of the people that come into this training. How do we see who's got the mental gusto and the grit to push through and become a Navy SEAL? And what she came up with was a 2-part formula. The first part being talent plus effort equals skill. And what she means by that is, if you think back to, say, your time at high school with sports or music or acting, I'm sure you'd always be able to think about a few people who were exceptionally talented, who it almost seemed to be effortless for them to be good at what they do. It almost like it came naturally. That's what she means by talent. And it was almost like they didn't have to put in much effort to be skillful. But what she's talking about here is then there's also people who may not have some of that talent, but they put in that extra effort. So if you have the talent and don't necessarily put in the effort, you could have the skill. But if you have lots of effort, some of the talent, you will become skillful. And the next phase of this is then skill plus effort is what equals achievement. And what she's talking about here is that effort is vitally important. Yes, you have to have some talent and you have to have some skill, but you can learn the skill through lots of effort, and you can achieve achievements by using that skill plus more effort to get it. And so this is what she's talking about, is actually the grit in people is the effort that they put into things, is what makes them get the skill, and then continuing that is what makes them get the achievement. So I found that really, really interesting, that actually it's not about, oh, you're either born with it or you're not. Same with leadership skills. There's this theory, in my opinion, I think it's a bit stupid, you're either born a leader or you're not. I think it's a bit of a farce. I think some people are more talented towards leadership, but you can certainly learn it. If you put the effort in, you'll become quite a good leader. You may not be as good as someone who's naturally talented and puts lots of effort in, but that doesn't mean it's not something attainable for you. And that's very much what Grit and Angela Duckworth's book talks about, is the fact that there is no genetic code that allows you to be a great achiever of anything. It's putting in double the effort all the time, driving through. That's what gets you to where you want to go. And when we go through the next books, hopefully that'll come through, that actually there's ways you can use your brain and the way it functions to your advantage to hone in onto that effort side of things, so that you can build great skills and you can achieve. So the next book to talk about is Charles Duhigg. Now there'll be 2 books from him. The first one is the one I recommend you read first, which is The Power of Habit. And there's 3 core areas that he focuses on in this book. And the first is the habit loop, which is a neurological pattern that governs habits, and which consists of 3 things, which is the cue, a routine, and then the reward. And one of the ways he talks about this is the story of Febreze, which is the air freshener spray. When they first came out with Febreze, it was designed to obviously cover and mask and remove really nasty smells, and so they trialed it on some seriously nasty smells, like sewage smells. And one of the stories he talks about was a lady who worked in the forestry department that always got smells from skunks, and she could never get rid of it. where Febreze got rid of it and masked all the smell and always made her place smell nice, even though she was coming home with skunk smell on her. But when they went out into the marketing campaign was very much targeted on, Febreze will get rid of all the nasty smells, any nasty smell in your house, it will remove it and it'll always smell pleasant. And their sales did really poorly. And when they looked into it a bit further, what they realized was actually they hadn't hit on that habit loop of when you do your cleaning, most people don't want to acknowledge if they have a bad smell in their house. No, my house is nice, or they don't have a bad smell, and so they don't see the point of using it. So what they did is they changed their Febreze story. Instead of going, oh, it's for getting rid of the bad smells, they went, how do we trigger that mechanism to become a habit that when you finish cleaning, the next step is to then go and use Febreze. The advert campaign then changed, and they went, when you finished all your cleaning, you've done your vacuuming, your mopping, everything, to get that extra bit of clean into your house, remember to use Febreze. So the cue was, you finish cleaning, go get your Febreze, spray around the house, and the reward you got was the lovely, fresh, clean smell that lasted all day. That reminded you that the house was clean and you'd done a good job. So that's what they did. And when they did that, sales went through the roof. And it was very much hitting at that habit loop. So the next rule that he had is called the golden rule of habit change. And this is, how do I change my habits? Or how do I replace habits that I already have? And what he talked about was very much the essence of keep the cue that's there, but replace the routine and keep a reward. And then the change will eventually occur. And so he talked about an example of the guy who set up Alcoholics Anonymous and how they changed that. I use that example on how I personally overcame smoking. I used to be a very heavy smoker in my teenage years. I haven't smoked in 15 to 20 years now. And the way I did it was very much by keeping the cue, which was I sort of looked at, well, when do I want to smoke? And it's usually when I finished a meal, if I'm out drinking, or if I've going for a walk, or I'm with friends like after university or after school, I want to go and have a cigarette. So I changed the cue by the cue being finishing a class or finishing a meal or out drinking to something else in terms of the routine. So instead of going, right, go have a cigarette, no, now I'm going to go for a walk, for instance, if it's after a meal. And the reward I would then get would be, one, I didn't have a cigarette, so that made me happy, but two, I'd get the endorphin release of doing some exercise and doing some walking. And same thing if I finished class, instead of going out and sitting with the smokers, the cue was, I finished class, so what do I need to go do? I need to go and change my routine. I would then go for a walk with people, I'd go to the gym, and again the reward would be the endorphin release of going and doing exercises and not smoking. And eventually I quit, and it took about 12 months or so to change. The third step he talks about is keystone habits, and these is how an individual pattern that is unintentionally capable of triggering other habits in the lives of people around you. And the example he talks about is Paul O'Neill and Alcoa. Now, Alcoa was a big aluminium smelting plant. It was one of the biggest in the world, but at the time that Paul O'Neill came in, he was unheard of, and the Alcoa plant had major issues with incidents and accidents. Its profit share was starting to decline. It was owned predominantly by big hedge funds and pension funds. And when Paul came in, he sat up there with all the shareholders and said, right, our focus over the next couple of years is going to be on safety. And there's a funny story of one of the hedge funds who quoted on this. He basically called up his stockbrokers and said, right, sell everything in Alcoa. They've got some hippie running the place now. It's going to go down the hill. Actually, Alcoa's stock price went through the roof over the coming years because what he instilled, and this is where this keystone habits kicks in, was he realized that safety was a major concern. But if he just told everyone, oh, you need to be safer, no one's going to listen. So what he actually did was he went, I wanted to increase the communication between all the different departments because he saw that as a major issue. And so whenever an incident occurred, within 24 hours, Paul O'Neill had to be made aware of what the incident was, who'd been informed, who'd been hurt, where it was, and what the plans and steps were to stop that from happening. And the way that was meant to occur, and the way it did occur, was whoever had the incident, the foreman at the site would then have to obviously understand what happened, who it was, and what the details were, would still talk to the next level up, and they would talk to the next level up until it eventually got to Paul. And all of them, within 24 hours, had to come up with a plan to make sure that never happened. And secretly what actually was happening there, and this is why it's called a keystone habit, was he was forcing a new habit onto people to communicate and break down those barriers between the different teams. So instead of it being a spreadsheet at the end of the month, it was phone calls within 15 minutes of the incident happening, and names being put to those incident numbers. So you actually knew who got hurt, what it meant to them, and you started to break down the barriers within the business so that everyone was actually communicating on people, not numbers in a spreadsheet, and it led to huge improvements within Alcoa. So Charles Duhigg's next book is Smarter, Faster and Better, and what this book really talks about is much more on that leadership side around that locus of control was one of the main bits I got out of the book. And locus of control is how when you are wanting to do a task, if you feel more in control on how that task is going to be done, the output that you expect out of that task is more in your control, your psyche and your mindset going into that task is much more positive. And so if that is the case, which it is, and this is what he proves within his book through a lot of different studies, is that actually motivation is triggered by the sense of you going into that piece of work. So if the control mechanism or the view of control that you might have, or even the perception of control you have going into a task, is changed from being a negative into a positive thought, you will actually work harder, and your brain will give you more motivation to want to work harder and do a better job at it. So he talks about how leaders can use this as to their advantage, that if you know that by giving control to people when they're doing a project makes them want to work harder and gives them more motivation to work, use that as a mechanism to encourage your team to work. And if you think about the Alcoa example, instead of saying, hey, I need you to be safer, hey, actually this is how we're going to do communication, and you need to own this process of communicating up and telling me what the plans were, not coming to me saying something happened and I'll tell you what we'll do to fix it. He put all the onus of control back onto his team to come up with solutions, talk to people and figure things out. And this is exactly what he talks about in Smarter, Faster, Better, is how can you use that ability the brain has to change how someone wants to perceive something and how they want to do it, and the motivation they then put behind it. So by giving locus of control to people on projects, you'll never really make them work harder without them even knowing it, but they'll also enjoy the fact that they're doing this project. So he further talks about how you can make something more enjoyable and more fun, where there's a chore that you've got to do, by making yourself more self-motivated by tricking the brain into thinking this act is actually much more desirable than it is. And again, thinking back to that sort of cue, routine and reward process that he talked about in Power of Habit, he's basically expanding upon this in more of a neurological sense with how to adapt the brain to doing what it is you want it to do. And so he talks about how when you're doing a chore or chores coming up, think about why this is actually important to you and give your brain those sort of key points to say, this is why it's important, this is the reward you're going to get out of it, and this is why it's useful. And your brain will then basically give you those triggers to make you feel more positive about doing what it is you maybe didn't want to do. I mean, Simon Sinek even talks about this in one of his talks, where he said, people often say, well, how do you not get nervous before talks? And he goes, I changed my mindset, because the difference between nervousness and exciting is the same. The heart rate goes up, you get sweaty palms, you lose focus on what you want to talk about. But if I'm excited going into a talk, I'm going to deliver a better talk than if I'm nervous. And so by tricking the brain into saying, I'm not nervous, I'm excited, I will deliver a better talk. And that's what he did. It's exactly the same what Charles Duhigg is saying here about tasks. So he commented on 6 things that you can do to basically train your brain to become more like this and change your views on the habits you have on certain tasks and actions that you need to do. So the first one is, people who are successful is create pictures in their minds of what they expect to see. Basically, this is envisioning. Envision what it is you want to see and what you want to do, and it will start to become reality. Michael Phelps did this with his swimming. Consistently looked at what it is he wanted to achieve and envisioned himself achieving that, so that when these things happened, he'd already played it in his mind 100 times. I mean, even Arnold Schwarzenegger talks about that when he did his speeches. He practiced those speeches in his mind and physically practiced the speeches hundreds of times before he delivered it, so that by the time he delivered it, it felt natural, because it was natural, because he practiced it so many times. Secondly, they tell themselves stories about what's going on as it occurs. So again, you're giving yourself mental playbacks of what's happening as it's happening. Thirdly, they narrate their own experiences within their heads. So apart from telling stories about what's going on as it occurs, they're also narrating their own experiences in their heads. And if you think about this, again, it's just further envisioning of what's happening. Narrate your own experiences. Look at how those experiences happened. What things did you see? What things didn't you see? What would you have liked to have said? What would you not have liked to have said? And by playing those things in your head, you're starting to cement them into your psyche, so that when those things happen again or do occur, your brain's already processed how you want to enact and how you want to react, to those things. Fourthly, they are more likely to answer questions with anecdotes rather than simple responses. And again, because you've practiced these scenarios, these questions, these situations in your head numerous times, you're more likely to be able to be much calmer when something happens. So for instance, if you're in a workplace and your boss asks you some really difficult questions, instead of getting defensive, because you've practiced the speech, you can actually be much more prepared to answer it with more of an anecdote rather than simply responding to, yes, I did this, then I did that, then I did this. You can calm it down and be much more direct with how you want to respond, which shows confidence in your response, because you are confident in what you're doing, but that's because you've prepped a dozen times beforehand mentally in your head. Fifth, they say when they daydream, they're often imagining future conversations. And again, this plays on sort of the 4 prior ones of have imaginary conversations in your head. I mean, my wife teases me all the time because I have imaginary conversations about situations that haven't occurred. But I get that from this book. Have conversations about certain situations, because just like practicing speeches, practicing conversations and scenarios in your head that haven't happened yet that might happen, means that when they do happen, you're very much more prepared, and your brain works in that sense to go, trigger, this is that conversation we practiced 6 months ago and did it a dozen times. I know what the response is that I want to do for this conversation. And then finally, number 6, they visualize their days by being much more specific than what the rest of us do. And is coined as what psychologists have phrased for this kind of habitual forecasting, i.e. creating mental models. And again, it just cements the last 5 steps of, by creating and visualizing what it is you want to do in numerous different scenarios, different conversations, different attitudes, different people, by constantly practicing these conversations in your head and practicing these scenarios and envisioning what's going to happen, when they do inevitably happen, you are so much calmer and more prepared, because your body and your mind doesn't go into fight or flight, because you know what it is you need to do. And if you think about Bruce Lee, give a great example of, he doesn't fear the person who's practiced 10,000 kicks once each. He fears the person who's practiced one kick 10,000 times, because that kick is going to become so natural to them they don't even have to think about how they do it. And that's the key thing that Charles Duhigg is talking about here with Smarter, Better, Faster. Once you know how your body works with habits, you can train it to change those habits, create new habits in your favor. And then with Smarter, Faster, Better, he's talking about how by doing the habit of having conversations, creating the visions of what you want to see in the future, how you want to act, how you want to respond, how you want to think about certain things and do certain things, you allow your body to be able, you allow your mind to be able to react at a much better manner when those certain situations come up. So if we think about this from a leadership perspective, what we've learned so far is to achieve the goals you want to achieve is double the effort compared to the talent and the skill. You need 2 times of effort compared to talent and skill. So if you put in more effort, you will achieve what you want to be able to do. Then if we know that, and we take into the fact how the brain works with habits, well, we know that we can train our brain to see certain habits, to create certain habits that we want to do. Like, for instance, not sitting there and watching 3 hours of Netflix after work when we get home, and maybe only watching 1 hour of Netflix and doing 1 hour of reading and 1 hour of exercise. We know that the hour of reading and the hour of exercise are going to benefit us a lot more than 3 hours of Netflix, but our habit is, I'll get home and I'll watch 3 hours of Netflix because I'm tired. But if we change our psyche on how we think about that, and we do some of these visioning sessions of creating pictures in our mind of what we might be like, what would be good if we do this, what am I going to say to myself when I get home at 6 p.m. at night and I've finished my dinner and I want to go and sit and watch TV? No, I'll change my cue and I'm going to do this and I'm going to feel better for it afterwards. And the more you do that, the less and less you have to fight against your old habits, because you've created a new habit loop. That's that golden rule of habit change. So by doing these 6 things and practicing conversations in your head, you're basically setting yourself up for success in the future. You're using effort to boost your talent and skill so you can achieve. And then finally, the last book is a bit of a different one. It's called Deviate by Beau, Lotto. And really what he talks about more is how does the brain more from a different standpoint on what it actually does, but how does it perceive what's going on around it, and how does it then take that on board? And if we think about when we've communicated with people, we've communicated something to somebody, 2 weeks later they communicate it back to you and it's completely different to what you said. How is it so vastly different when you've said explicitly what it is? Or they read something and you read something and you both interpret it completely differently. It's very much what Beau Lotto is talking about here. And it's, to me, I think it's a good wrapper. After you've learned here's sort of the science on how the brain works and how motivation and habits work and how we can use that to help us to become better people and better leaders, then taking that sort of step back and going, but then how does the brain actually perceive what it is and what's the reality of what we see? And one of the things he gives is the old sort of tale of, if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? And what he talks about there is what is sound to our brains might be different to other life forms or environments that don't perceive sound the way we perceive sound. So we perceive sound because of the way our ears are developed and the way our brain then interprets those sound waves beat against our eardrum, which vibrates and causes a vibration which causes us to hear. But someone who's deaf would feel it differently compared to a lizard, compared to any animal or microorganism or anything. What is sound? And he's saying what he's trying to get here is it's much more about how our brains are delusional to the reality of what we perceive our reality to be. And it's like that sort of weirdly conceptual, but what he then talks about is, well, if that reality of what we see and understand is that, and we know that it can be different, well then that means that our reality can change. And we change our reality on what we know by asking why and deviating from the norm. And so if you think about what we've learned from the other 3 books and how the brain works, this is further talking about more of a conceptual point of how do we make sure that we don't pigeonhole our thinking on how the brain works and what other people are thinking, what they may perceive, by taking that step back and realizing that our brains are limited to their sense of reality based on what we know and what we see around us and how we perceive the world. So since we don't have direct access to the world and the people and their perception of reality is only based on their own experiences, we're all working in these tiny, unique, separate bubbles to each other. And that's why you get things like lost in communication. One of the things that just to close off on here, that I liked with his quote was, listening is the diminishment of the answers you project on the world around you. It lets in the possibility of questions, and through questions my assumptions might come to map onto your assumptions, resulting in a connection. Now that's what he's trying to talk about there, is the fact that if I listen to what you're talking about and I remove my view of reality and hear what your view of reality is, we might then start to create a connection that changes both our realities, because our brains are stuck in the way that they think based on what we know, see, heard, and experienced. But we can open up our brains by realizing that and listening to what everyone else is saying and what's going on, and not just taking what we see and hear and read as fact. Always look to see what the opposites might be and deviate from the norm. Anyway, I hope that was useful. I said these 4 books I feel individually are all fantastic, but when they come together they give such a broader spectrum on what it means to be personally motivated, personally driven, how to achieve your goals, and how to help others achieve their goals, which to me I think makes you a much better leader when it comes to work and to personal life. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed. Obviously, like I said, if you like this, hit the like button and subscribe. Hope to see you in the next one. Bye.